Hello and welcome to the Book of Revelation, Historicist View. This is Part 8, the Fifth Seal Voices. Today we're going to glance with John at the souls under the altar. We're also going to talk about who they are and why they're there. Now, out of the whole New Testament, these verses may bring fear more quickly than any other to believers. That's understandable. So many people think this is all ahead of them. And there's no denying that believers still die all over the world for their faith, but is this the fulfillment of this seal? I would say it's the remnant of it. And I pray that after today, all fear will be replaced with compassion, hope, and even praise, because God has a marvelous unfolding plan to vindicate these injustices. But first, as always, let's quickly recap the last study where we saw the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse ride forth, each armed for their particular mission. We saw the first seal of the white horse, fulfilled by the period in Roman history called Pax Romana. It was 84 years of peace, prosperity, and expansion under the five good emperors. Next, we saw the second seal of the red horse, fulfilled by Rome's history known as the period of disorder. This was brought on by civil war, political instability, and the rumblings at Rome's borders because barbarian forces sought to take advantage of Rome's internal crisis. Next, we saw the third seal of the black horse, fulfilled by Rome's economic crash, also known as the crisis of the 3rd century. Inflation, taxation, poverty, and the beginnings of famine, all natural progressive events from continual warfare. But it wreaked havoc and affected every sphere of the Roman Empire, not just the poor. And finally, we saw the fourth seal of the pale horse, fulfilled by Rome's decline in population by the end of that 3rd century. Now, the rider of this horse, named Death, reduced a quarter of the Roman Empire's population by war, famine, plague, and wild beasts. Now, besides the increased number of wild beasts due to depopulation, persecution had already arrived, and throwing Christians to the lions was commonplace. And as we're going to see today, it only ramped up. So as we go through this history of the next seal, let's keep our eyes fixed on Psalm 116, verse 15, which says, "Precious in the sight of the Lord, Yahweh, is the death of one of his saints." And we also need to remember that these horses were dispatched to recompense, to pay back the fourth beast of Daniel, the Roman Empire. Why? Because he touched the apple of God's eye, and Rome is just getting started. So, are you ready to visit the souls under the altar? Can you already hear their cry? Now, as we venture to unwrap the symbolism of this fifth seal, we read in Revelation chapter 6, verses 9 through 11, "When he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who have been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. They cried out with a loud voice, 'O sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long before you judge and avenge our blood on those who dwell on the earth?' Then they were each given a white robe and told to rest a little longer until the number of their fellow servants and their brethren should be killed as they were." So this cry, "O sovereign Lord, how long?" it really does sound as though they are calling for justice or vengeance, doesn't it? What is the history behind this fifth seal? Well, we're going to begin to look at it by thinking about souls and what they are. And it's not easy to distinguish between soul and spirit, though plenty of people have tried, and I've yet to see a really good, clear distinction. Though this one from Holding to the Truth in Love comes fairly close. They talk about our three body parts, spirit, soul, and body. And using this illustration, they refer to the outer circle as our body, where our five senses contact all things physical in the material world. They move inward to the middle circle, referring to our soul. This is where they say our mind, emotion, and will contact all things psychological. And then finally, the inner circle, referring to our spirits. They say this is where we contact God and maybe our conscience resides. And again, this is not "thus saith the Lord," but it's a pretty good, easy concept to wrap your mind around. However, if you keep looking, you might find something like this from the threefold nature of man, where they put the soul in the center. They swap out spirit and soul. So what do you do with that, right? Well, first you realize that these are just pictures. It's man's attempt to understand how fearfully and wonderfully we're made. And it's kind of like John saying, the streets of New Jerusalem are paved with pure gold. Well, that's not likely, and it's very impractical. Maybe John is just telling us that the things we elevate to the highest positions here are really the lowest rank in heaven. So in that sense, we don't really have to nail down what soul versus spirit is. We just have to understand why they're depicted this way. But before we leave this idea of soul versus spirit, I do want to say I really like this analogy from Tim Greenwood Ministries in his article, You Are the Temple of the Holy Spirit. Here we see the most holy place where God dwelled on earth, representing our spirit or our heart. Now, of course, that's not our blood pumping muscle, but it's the place where we begin a relationship with God. Maybe this is our conscience where, we find out what's right and wrong, good and evil. Next, we move to the holy place where we find the altar of incense, and that has always represented the prayers of the saints ascending to God. It also has the lampstand and the table of showbread. Both of these picture the Word of God. So this is where our minds are renewed by reading the Word of God, but only after our hearts have been transformed. And then we move to the outer court, which represents our body, which both in word and deed follow because of the inner transformation that we've had. This is a great picture of how the Lord recreates us, but what did it have to do with these souls under the altar? Well, the Greek word soul is number 5590. It's suke, and its meaning is breath or spirit, even though it's translated sometimes as soul. Well, when we look at the creation of man in chapter 2 of Genesis, where God formed man from the dust of the ground, we see something very interesting. We realize this was just a shell. It was only a shell until God breathed the breath of life into Adam and he became a living being. Now, looking at the Septuagint there in Genesis, it's this word being that is suke, breath or spirit. And I think spirit is probably a better translation. But it's why he became a living being, because this breath was breathed into him. And that's why these souls are now bodiless entities under the altar, right? Their breath has left them, and they're no longer living sukes. So we really just have to ask now, why are they under the altar? And rather than picture them something like this, these bodiless entities, as I said, under some huge altar, we really need to look at this altar, the bronze altar or brazen altar as it's sometimes called. And unfortunately, we don't really understand these pictures. We've relegated them to somehow being gone and not having any meaning for us today. But the fact is, they were pictures, always have been pictures of what Jesus was going to do. And so by not understanding these a little bit better, I think we miss maybe the magnitude of what Christ did for us. So let's begin with Leviticus chapter 4, where we're told that the priest shall pour all of the rest of the blood of the bullock at the bottom of the altar of the burnt offering, which is at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. Now, as I said earlier, we don't really understand, we think this is ritualistic behavior, and we need a little help with these pictures. Now, Ritchie Christian Media from the United Kingdom has a really good article called Blood at the Bottom of the Brazen Altar, and they can help us with these pictures. They say the brazen altar was the first item of furniture encountered by the Israelite approaching God. He could not avoid it. The Israelite was being taught in type that he must needs go home by the way of the cross. That great altar, the largest item of furniture in the tabernacle, loomed before the Israelite as he entered the court. What a great picture, right? You walk into the outer court and this is the first thing you see, and you can't get any further until you deal with sin. How? By the shedding of blood. What a great picture of what Messiah did. They continue, the blood was poured out at the base of the altar as part of the sin offering. They say this teaches us that the blood of Christ is the basis or foundation upon which the principle of sin can be dealt with. They tell us, however, blood was also poured at the bottom of the altar as part of the sin offering when the priests were consecrated. They say we could never be fit to minister before God as priests without the shedding of blood. Our consecration rests on his sacrifice. The same blood that dealt with my sin and all sins fits me to approach God as a priest. Now, let's not forget what Jesus told us at the beginning of the book of Revelation, that we have been made priests and kings to our God. Christian Study Library also speaks on this souls under the altar, and they ask, where does John see these souls of the martyrs? He sees them under the altar. This is not the altar of incense that stood in the holy place just outside the curtains of the Holy of Holies. This is the altar of sacrifice that stood in the outer court and upon which animals were sacrificed, their blood being poured out at the base of the altar. Do you see the imagery, he asks? Where you would see the blood of sacrifice on the Old Testament altar, you now see the souls of the martyrs. Their blood has been poured out as they have sealed their faith in death. And we remember that Leviticus chapter 17 tells us, for the life of the flesh is in the blood. Again, these souls are depicted as being under the altar because they became martyrs, or witnesses is what that word really is. Just like Jesus, remember, he's the faithful and true witness or martyr. And they were faithful unto death, just as he charged them to be. And this life blood of an offering being poured out at the bottom of the altar on the ground. Wow, this really clarifies, right? Yeshua, Jesus' own death on the cross, when he relinquished his spirit and died, and the Roman soldier having thrust the spear through his side, and water and blood flowing forth. Where? Onto the ground at the base of his altar, the cross. This is the quintessential picture of sacrifice and martyrdom, and I believe that's why they're pictured here. So next we just have to say, well, why were they martyred? Why were they slain? And we're told it was because of the word of God and the testimony that they held. So I believe that was the testimony of Jesus, because as we've already seen in this book of Revelation, the commandments of God, keeping the commandments and having faith in Jesus, is a thread throughout the entire book. We saw it with the 24 elders when they represented not only the 12 patriarchs or 12 tribes of Israel, the Old Testament church, if you will, but they also represented the 12 disciples or the New Testament church. We saw it in the 4 living beings that are always before the throne leading worship, in that they represented the 4 standards or banners of the leading tribes around the tabernacle, 3 on each side. But they also represented the 4 gospels, or at least the evangelists who wrote those gospels, again, the Old and the New Testament saints. We see it in New Jerusalem itself in the book of Revelation, where the 12 gates have the 12 names of the tribes of Israel engraved upon them, and the 12 foundation pillars with the names of the 12 disciples. This is a beautiful picture of why they were slain, because they kept the commandments of God and they had faith in Jesus. Now, this was the given when John received the revelation, and for the next several centuries, it's what defined who the believers were. It's only now that we're relearning this and finding the ancient paths which we're told to seek, and understanding that this was the faith once delivered to the saints. Okay, now on to the historicist interpretation of this 5th seal. It is the great persecution under Diocletian in 303 AD to 313 AD. It was a 10-year period, and we're going to be looking today at Fox's Book of Martyrs. But first, John Gill tells us that even though this final and greatest persecution, the 10th one, is the fulfillment of this seal, really all of the martyrs in the preceding 9 persecutions deserve a mention. He says, quote, "Them that were slain." These include not only all the martyrs that were put to death in the persecution of Diocletian, but all those that suffered in all the persecutions preceding. For this being the last, involves them all. Now, Mr. Fox tells us that it has been said that the lives of the early Christians consisted of persecution above ground and prayer below ground. Their lives are expressed both by the Colosseum and the catacombs. Beneath Rome are the excavations, which we call the catacombs, which were at once temples and tombs. The early church of Rome, he says, might well be called the church of the catacombs. He tells us that there are some 60 catacombs near Rome, in which some 600 miles of galleries have been traced, and these are not all. These galleries are about 8 feet high and from 3 to 5 feet wide, containing on either side several rows of long, low, horizontal recesses, one above another, like berths in a ship. In these, the dead bodies were placed, and the front closed either by a single marble slab or several great tiles laid in mortar. And on these slabs or tiles, epitaphs or symbols are engraved or painted. Now he tells us that both pagans and Christians buried their dead in these catacombs, but when the Christian graves have been opened, the skeletons tell their own terrible tale. Heads are found severed from the body, ribs and shoulder blades are broken, bones are often calcined from fire. But despite, he says, the awful story of persecution that we may read here, the inscriptions breathe forth peace and joy and triumph. Now I want to look at just a few examples of those inscriptions because, again, I think they tell a story in and of themselves. These believers facing horrible persecution and heavy trials still find peace. Why? Because believers know death does not have the final say. One example, here lies Marcia, put to rest in a dream of peace, and Lawrence to his sweetest son, borne away of angels. And finally, being called away, he went in peace. Now, contrasting that to some of the epitaphs of the pagans, we find, live for the present hour, since we are sure of nothing else. And I lift my hands against the gods who took me away at the age of 20, though I had done no harm. And traveler, curse me not as you pass, for I am in darkness and cannot answer. The tale of woe that these epitaphs, these souls of the lost pagans, in their final moment, whether it was persecution or death by some other cause, really giving believers all the more hope that if you're persecuted, but Messiah is in you and you with him, there is hope and there is peace. Now I want to move quickly through all of the preceding persecutions because those martyrs deserve no less recognition than those of the 10th persecution. But I do want to issue a small warning that the language used by Mr. Fox is graphic, it's sensitive, and I'm not given to using sensitive material, particularly just for hyperbole, but I do believe in this case, in our context today, that it's not only okay but necessary. You know, ugly truth is no less true. And just like tough love, which can shake up believers, I believe that ugly truth can wake them up when they need it. So the first persecution under Nero in AD 67, we're told by Mr. Fox that among other diabolical whims, he ordered the city of Rome to be set on fire, and while the imperial city was in flames, he went to the Tower of Macinus, played his harp, sung the song of the burning of Troy, and openly declared that he wished the ruin of all things before his death. Mr. Fox tells us this was the occasion of the first persecution, and the barbarities exercised on the Christians were such as even excited the commiseration of the Romans themselves. Nero, he says, refined upon cruelty and contrived all manner of punishments that even the most infernal imagination could design. In particular, he had some sewed up in the skins of wild beasts and then worried by dogs until they expired, and others dressed in shirts made stiff with wax, fixed to axle trees, and set on fire in his gardens in order to illuminate them. Now we're told that this persecution was general throughout the whole Roman Empire, but it rather increased than diminished the spirit of Christianity. And in this persecution, we're told St. Paul and St. Peter were both martyred. Now the second persecution under Domitian in 81 AD, we remember that Domitian is the emperor who banished John to Patmos. We're told that Domitian, who was naturally inclined to cruelty, first slew his brother and then raised the second persecution against the Christians. In his rage, he put to death some of the Roman senators, some through malice, and others to confiscate their estates. He then commanded all the lineage of David be put to death. Among the numerous martyrs that suffered during this persecution was Simon, Bishop of Jerusalem, who was crucified, and St. John, who purportedly was first boiled in oil and afterwards banished to Patmos. Now, if this history is correct, I can't even imagine John receiving this revelation from John and really being able to feel the pain, so to speak, of what was coming. A variety of fabricated tales were during this reign composed in order to injure the Christians. Such was the infatuation of the pagans that if famine, pestilence, or earthquakes afflicted any of the Roman provinces, it was laid upon the Christians. Now these persecutions among the Christians increased the number of informers, and many, for the sake of gain, swore away the lives of the innocent. Now I can hear Yeshua, Jesus' words now, that many would turn on one another, even believers. Under the third persecution of Trajan in 108 AD, we remember that Trajan was one of those 5 good emperors. We're told that Ignatius, who had been appointed to the bishopric of Antioch next after Peter in succession, some do say that he, being sent from Syria to Rome because he professed Christ, was given to the wild beasts to be devoured. Now Trajan was succeeded by Adrian, or Hadrian, depending upon where you read, the latter continuing the third persecution with as much severity as his predecessor. And about this time, Alexander, Bishop of Rome, with his 2 deacons, were martyred, as were Quirinus and Hermes with their families, Zenon, a Roman nobleman, and about 10,000 other Christians, says Mr. Fox. At the martyrdom of Faustinus and Jovita, brothers and citizens of Brescia, their torments were so many and their patience so great that Calocharis, a pagan, beholding them, was struck with admiration and exclaimed in a kind of ecstasy, "Great is the God of the Christians," for which he was apprehended and suffered a similar fate. The fourth persecution under another one of those 5 good emperors, Marcus Aurelius, in 162 AD, we're told that in this persecution many of the spectators shuddered with horror at the sight, as some of the martyrs were obliged to pass with their already wounded feet over thorns, nails, sharp shells, etc., upon their points. Others were scourged until their sinews and veins lay bare. And after suffering the most excruciating tortures that could be devised, Mr. Fox tells us, they were destroyed by the most terrible deaths. It's under this fourth persecution that Polycarp, the venerable bishop of Smyrna, hearing that persons were seeking for him, escaped, but then was discovered by a child. After feasting the guards who apprehended him, he desired an hour of prayer, in which, being allowed, he said to have prayed with such fervency that his guards repented that they had been instrumental in taking him. He was, however, carried before the proconsul, condemned, and burnt in the marketplace. Now the story continues that the proconsul told him, well, just reproach Christ and I will free you. To which the now famous reply came, 86 years have I served him, and he never once wronged me. How then shall I blaspheme my king who has saved me? Justin, the celebrated philosopher, also fell a martyr in this persecution. And about the year 133, when he was 33 years of age, he became a convert to Christianity. And then, for the first time, says Mr. Fox, he perceived the real nature of truth. Now, he wrote many tracts and debated in favor of Christianity, and this is what really got him in trouble. Justin and 6 of his companions were apprehended, and being commanded to sacrifice to the pagan idols, they refused, and they were condemned to be scourged and then beheaded, which sentence was executed with all imaginable severity, Mr. Fox tells us. Now, the 5th persecution under Septimius Severus in 192 AD. We're told that Severus, having been recovered from a severe fit of sickness by a Christian, became a great favorer of the Christians in general, but the prejudice and fury of the ignorant multitude prevailing, obsolete laws were put in execution against the Christians. The progress of Christianity alarmed the pagans, and so they revived the stale calumny of placing accidental misfortunes to the account of its professors. In other words, blaming them for everything that happened. Victor, the Bishop of Rome, suffered martyrdom in the first year of the 3rd century AD 201, and we're told that Leonidas, the father of the celebrated Origen, was beheaded for being a Christian. Origen as well suffered martyrdom during this time. Many of his hearers likewise suffered martyrdom, particularly 2 brothers named Plutarchus and Cyranus. Another Cyranus, Hieron and Heraclides, were beheaded, and Rheus, we're told, had boiled pitch poured upon her head and was then burnt, as was Marcella, her mother. Saint Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyon, born in Greece, he was a zealous opposer of heresies in general, and about AD 187 he wrote a celebrated tract against heresy, amongst many other tracts in support of Christians. And like Justin, this zeal in favor of Christianity pointed him out as an object of resentment to the emperor, and in AD 202 he was beheaded. The 6th persecution under Maximus in 235 AD. We're told that the principal persons who perished under this reign were Pontianus, the Bishop of Rome, and Teros, a Grecian, his successor, who gave offense to the government by merely collecting the acts of the martyrs. Pamachius and Quiritus, Roman senators with all their families, and many other Christians. Simplicius, a senator. Calipodius, a Christian minister, thrown into the Tiber River. Martina, a noble and beautiful virgin, and Hippolytus, a Christian prelate, tied to a wild horse and dragged until he expired. During this persecution raised by Maximus, or Maximinus, wherever you're reading it, numberless Christians were slain without trial and buried indiscriminately in heaps, sometimes 50 or 60 being cast into a pit together, without the least decency, says Mr. Fox. The tyrant Maximinus died in AD 238. He was succeeded by Gordian, during whose reign and that of his successor Philip, the church was free from persecution for the space of more than 10 years. But in AD 249, a violent persecution broke out in Alexandria at the instigation of a pagan priest without the knowledge of the emperor. Now this just speaks to me of, the real evil here, even behind the emperors or even paganism, is the enemy of our soul, Satan. The 7th persecution under Decius in 249 AD, we're told that Decius was jealous of the amazing increase of Christianity because the heathen temples began to be forsaken and the Christian churches thronged. Now, the heathens in general were ambitious to enforce the imperial decrees upon this occasion, and they looked upon the murder of a Christian as a merit to themselves. The martyrs under this occasion, says Mr. Fox, were innumerable. One such example, Peter, a young man, was beheaded for refusing to sacrifice to Venus. He purportedly said, quote, "I am astonished you should sacrifice to an infamous woman, whose debaucheries even your own historians record, and whose life consisted of such actions as your laws would punish. No, I shall offer the true God the acceptable sacrifice of praises and prayers, unquote. The prisoner was stretched upon a wheel by which all his bones were broken, and then he was sent to be beheaded. Nichomachus was ordered to sacrifice to the pagan idols. He replied, "I cannot pay that respect to devils which is due only to the Almighty." He was put to the rack. After enduring the torments for a time, he recanted. But scarcely had he given this proof of his frailty, says Mr. Fox, than he fell into the greatest agonies, dropped down on the ground, and expired immediately. Denisa, only 16 years of age, who beheld this terrible judgment, suddenly exclaimed, "Oh, unhappy wretch, why would you buy a moment's ease at the expense of a miserable eternity?" Denisa, avowing herself to be a Christian, was beheaded soon after. The eighth persecution under Valerian in 257 AD. We're told about Saturninus, the pious Orthodox bishop of Toulouse, was beheaded in the same year, refusing to sacrifice to idols, and he was treated with all the barbarous indignities imaginable, and fastened by the feet to the tail of a bull. Upon a signal given, the enraged animal was driven down the steps of the temple, by which the worthy martyr's brains were dashed out. We're also told of 300 Christians at Utica being placed round a burning lime kiln. A pan of coals and incense being prepared, they were commanded either to sacrifice to Jupiter or to be thrown into the kiln. Unanimously refusing, they bravely jumped into the pit and were immediately suffocated. Alexander, Malchus, and Priscus, 3 Christians of Palestine, with a woman of the same place, voluntarily accused themselves of being Christians, on which account they were sentenced to be devoured by tigers, which sentence, Mr. Fox says, was executed accordingly. Maxima, Donatilla, and Secunda, 3 virgins of Taberga, had gall and vinegar given them to drink, were then severely scourged, tormented on a gibbet, rubbed with lime, scorched on a gridiron, worried by wild beasts, and at length beheaded. Now this gall and vinegar being offered them, the same drink offered to our Lord, and him refusing, the drink was said to have narcotic effects. And you could choose to see this as an act of mercy, right? So that people didn't fear or feel all the pain. Or you could choose to look at this as making the persecutors feel a little bit better, like maybe what they're doing isn't as horrific as it really is. Either way, it's not enough to behead us. It's not enough to crucify us on a cross, but to have so many reprehensible acts committed and then to behead us. It just speaks of the veracity of the hatred that our enemy has for our Lord and for us. The ninth persecution under Aurelian in 274 AD, we're told that Agapetus was seized as a Christian, tortured, and then beheaded. Now, Mr. Fox goes on to say that few martyrs are actually on record during this reign because it was soon put a stop to by the emperors being murdered by his own domestics at Byzantium. And then Tacitus, Probus, Carus, Cornelius, and Numerian, all reigning in succession, and during their reigns, the church had peace. But of those few on record, he tells us of Marcus and Marcellianus, 2 twins, natives of Rome and of noble descent. Their parents were heathens, but the tutors to whom their education was trusted brought them up as Christians. Their parents and whole families eventually became converts to the faith, and they were martyred by being tied to posts and having their feet pierced with nails. After remaining in this situation for a day and night, their sufferings were put an end to by thrusting lances through their bodies. Next, we're told a fairly amazing story. A legion of soldiers consisting of 6,666 men contained none but Christians, and they refused either to sacrifice or swear to killing other Christians. So the order was given that the legion be decimated, that is, every 10th man to be selected from the rest and put to the sword. This bloody order having been put into execution, those who remained alive were still inflexible. In other words, they held to their testimony. So a second decimation took place, and every 10th man of those living was put to death. Now, I'm not sure, but I think the account goes that this did not satisfy the bloodthirstiness of those in charge, and eventually the entire legion was put to the sword. You know, and it's not hard to imagine that there was a whole legion of nothing but Christians. We can't forget that during that first century, you know, the gospel really went forth and evangelized many Romans who held high-ranking jobs in the government or the military. And so I can conceive of there being a legion of nothing but Christians. And now we arrive at the 10th persecution, also known as the Great Persecution under Emperor Diocletian in 303 AD. Diocletian was very busy trying to save his vast empire. We're going to see that he was no friend to Christianity, but was probably more of an accomplice behind the greater evil. And in an attempt to save his empire, he implemented the tetrarchy. It was a system of multiple emperors. We're going to look at that more next time under the 6th seal because it comes into play there. But the Diocletianic, or Great Persecution, was the last and most severe persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire. In 303 AD, the emperors Diocletian, Maximian, Galerius, and Constantius issued a series of edicts rescinding Christians' legal rights and demanding that they comply with traditional religious practices. Later edicts targeted the clergy and demanded universal sacrifice, ordering all inhabitants to sacrifice to the gods. The persecution varied in intensity across the empire. It was weakest in Gaul and Britain, where only the first edict was applied, and strongest in the eastern provinces. Now, Spangler from the University of Oregon tells us from Rome's Politics and the Tolerance of Christians, quote, "In the beginning of the 4th century, Rome had barely survived a political and economic downfall. Can anybody say the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse? But was put back into order by the military general and new emperor, Diocletian. Like many rulers before him, Diocletian was a traditional believer in the Roman gods, and he staunchly believed that Christians were the very reason for strife throughout the country. He thought that Christians were disloyal, that they disrupted social unity, and that they displeased the gods. Diocletian soon began the great persecution against Christians and stripped them of their rights and burned their scriptures and churches before enslaving, torturing, and murdering thousands. It was the most determined, long-lasting, and sophisticated persecution in Roman history. And this also clues us into how it happens, right? Burn the books, close the churches, enslave, torture, murder. Mr. Fox tells us that under the Roman emperors, commonly called the era of the martyrs, this 10th persecution, occasioned partly by the increasing number and luxury of the Christians, but also by the hatred of Galerius, the adopted son of Diocletian, who, being stimulated by his mother, a bigoted pagan, never ceased persuading the emperor to enter upon the persecution until he had accomplished his purpose. Now, next I want to talk about the Festival of Terminalia. This is a depiction of that festival. It's in honor of the god of Terminus, or the god of boundaries, and it was well established in the Roman society. John Fox is going to tell us that they chose the first day of this feast to commence the persecution. The fatal day fixed upon to commence the bloody work was the 23rd of February, AD 303, that being the day in which the Terminalia were celebrated, and on which, as the cruel pagans boasted, they hoped to put an end or termination to Christianity. On the appointed day, the persecution began in Nicomedia, on the morning which the prefect of that city repaired with a great number of officers and assistants to the church of the Christians, where, having forced open the doors, they seized upon all the sacred books and committed them to the flames. We're told that the whole of this transaction was in the presence of Diocletian and Galerius, who, not contented with burning the books, had the church leveled with the ground. This was followed by a severe edict commanding the destruction of all other Christian churches and books, and an order soon succeeded to render Christians of all denominations outlaws. The publication of this edict occasioned an immediate martyrdom because a bold Christian not only tore it down from the place to which it was affixed, but execrated the name of the emperor for his injustice. A provocation like this was sufficient to call down pagan vengeance upon his head. He was accordingly seized, severely tortured, and then burned alive. Next, Mr. Fox tells us that all the Christians were apprehended and imprisoned, and Galerius privately ordering the imperial palace to be set on fire so that the Christians might be charged as the incendiaries, and a plausible pretense given for carrying on the persecution with the greater severities. And that reminds me of the first persecution under Nero. Burn Rome and blame the Christians. He continues, a general sacrifice was commenced, which occasioned various martyrdoms. No distinction was made of age or sex. The name of Christian was so obnoxious to the pagans that all indiscriminately fell sacrifice to their opinions. Many houses were set on fire, and whole Christian families perished in the flames. Others had stones fastened about their necks, and being tied together, were driven into the sea. We're told that the persecution became general in all the Roman provinces, but more particularly in the east. And as it lasted 10 years, Mr. Fox says it's impossible to ascertain the numbers martyred or to enumerate the various modes of martyrdom. Racks, scourges, swords, daggers, crosses, poison, famine, all of these were made use of in various parts, trying to dispatch the Christians. An invention was exhausted in devising tortures against people who had no crime other than thinking differently. Tired with slaughter eventually, several governors of provinces represented to the imperial court the impropriety of this conduct, and hence many were respited from execution. But though they were not put to death, as much as possible was done to render their lives miserable, many of them having their ears cut off, their noses slit, their right eyes put out, their limbs rendered useless by dreadful dislocations, and their flesh seared in conspicuous places with red-hot irons. Truly, this is the fulfillment of the fifth seal, martyrdom. 9 persecutions under various emperors, even during Pax Romana, ramping up progressively, and culminating in the 10th persecution by Emperor Diocletian. It lasted 10 years, and it was the cause of more bloodshed and murder than the other 9 combined. Let's look again at this cry of the martyrs. How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth? Now, if we look at the Greek word used, it's krazo, number 2896. It means properly to croak as a raven or scream, to call aloud, shriek, exclaim, entreat, cry out. And they're doing this loudly. So, are they calling for vengeance? Do they want blood? Mr. Albert Barnes tells us it would be proper that there should be an expression of the divine sense of the wrongs that had been done them. He continues, it is not right to desire vengeance or revenge, but it is right to desire that justice should be done and that the government of God should be vindicated. Mr. Matthew Henry adds, they commit their cause to him to whom vengeance belongs and leave it in his hand. They are not avenging themselves, but leave all to God. I concur. I don't think these souls, as we're going to see here shortly, are really worried about anything. But this is letting us know that as saints, we should care about righteousness and God's government being vindicated, so to speak. Next, I want to look at these white robes that were given everyone. And Mr. Gill, again, tells us something we might not see. He says, the Alexandrian copy and some others read in the singular number, a white robe. And so does the Syriac version, as a token of their innocence that they did not suffer or were slain for any capital crime or immorality that they were guilty of. Now, I love what Mr. Gill is implying here. First off, singularly, this is not just a group of souls under the altar. These are individual souls that Jesus knows the very names of it. And he's commending them one at a time. Here is your robe. Here is your white robe. And secondly, that, they were murdered or put to death at the hand of the state, so to speak, for capital crimes. And so these white robes, talk about screaming, they scream, you're innocent of the charge brought against you. And that's awesome. And this white robe does something else. It earns them a place of honor amongst others who are wearing white, like Jesus in his transfiguration. Like the Ancient of Days that Daniel saw, this is God the Father wearing a white robe. And then we remember Jesus telling the Laodiceans, buy from me white raiment. It's pretty important. We've seen the 24 elders dressed in white robes. And of course, angels are depicted as being dressed in white sometimes. But the quintessential white robe is, of course, on the bride of Christ. And Revelation 19 tells us that her fine white linen is the righteousness of the saints. And it was said unto them that they should rest yet for a little season. Let's talk about this word rest. Now, the Greek word used here is anapauo. It means to repose or to be exempt, to refresh. But I really want to talk about its relationship to the Sabbath. And this is not something you can see in the English or the Greek. We're going to go to the Old Testament and the Hebrew language. And I'm going to use Leviticus chapter 25, verse 4, which tells us, but the seventh year shall be a Sabbath of rest unto the land, a Sabbath for Yahweh. Thou shalt neither sow thy field nor prune thy vineyard. This phrase, Sabbath of rest, is what we're looking at here, because when we look at these words individually, we see some interesting things as far as how they're translated. Now, in the Hebrew, the word for Sabbath is Shabbat. It's number 7676, and the Greek is Sabbaton. So those are three different languages, but you can see the similarities, right? Shabbat, Sabbaton, Sabbath. Why is this? Well, I believe it's because we're treating this word as a proper noun. It's the name of the seventh day. And just like proper names, my name is Brenda in English, but were I to travel to Israel or Italy or France or Germany, my name is still Brenda. Now, it may be said a little differently by people living in those countries, but it's going to be very close, just like this, Shabbat, Sabbaton, Sabbath. However, when we get to the word rest, in the Greek it's anapauo, and that doesn't even look similar to Sabbaton. But if you just look at the Hebrew, it's very close. You can see the connection, Shabbat, Shabbaton. In fact, it's just a variant, number 7677. You can't see the connection in English or Greek, but you can see it definitely in the Hebrew. So my point is that these slain saints are not anxious, they're not angry, and they're not really even waiting. And they're certainly not waiting for their rest to be over, like they're going to rest for a little season. No, they have entered their eternal rest, their Sabbath of rest. So, seeing that this is not about yet for a little season, what is the yet for a little season about? Well, we're going to find out that that has to do with until their brethren should be killed as they were, is fulfilled. And Matthew Henry tells us this is a language rather suited to the imperfect state of the saints in this world, rather than to the perfection of their state in heaven. He says there's no impatience, no uneasiness, no need of admonition there. But in this world, there's great need of patience. He says, observe. Number one, there is a number of Christians known to God who are appointed as sheep for the slaughter, set apart to be God's witnesses. Now that's sobering. He knows who yet has to be martyred. Number two, as the measure of the sin of persecutors is filling up, so is the number of the persecuted, martyred servants of Christ. And thirdly, when this number is fulfilled, God will take a just and glorious revenge upon their cruel persecutors. He will recompense tribulation to those who trouble them, and to those that are troubled, full and uninterrupted rest. Can you even imagine uninterrupted rest? It's coming. Now, there are 2 points that I want to make as we near the close of today's video. And the first one is that we are losing this history, and so agrees JesusIsLord.com when they share what they found on the internet. They found that although Roman persecutions for early Christians continued for about 3 centuries and never stopped during that era, the historians used to assign it into 10 great persecutions occasioned by 10 Roman emperors. Used to assign it? They also found what is sad today is that history is being rewritten. Current history says that Nero did not persecute Christians. This is what Compton's Interactive Encyclopedia from 1998 recorded, quote, "Nero's unsavory reputation is almost wholly undeserved. He was certainly not the bloody dictator that Roman and Christian historians have depicted." Well, that certainly is rewriting history. They go on to set the record straight and tell us that for those who care to open their eyes as to what is happening, they will see that a frightful situation is arisen. And they tell us 4 things. Number 1, we are undereducated and miseducated. Number 2, revisionist historians are speedily changing the historical record. Number 3, old books, along with the correct information that they contain, are disappearing off of the shelves. And number 4, people who want information may only be able to find lies. And then they list the 10 persecutions under the 10 emperors that we discussed today. Now, I want to give you an incentive to come back next week, so I'm going to highlight their cliffhanger. They say the persecutors did not prevail. The church continued. But soon came Constantine the Great in 312 AD. Constantine's name may not be on an official list of popes. This person recalls that there's more than one list. But there are those, they say, that mark Constantine as basically the beginning of the Roman Catholic Church. With Constantine, one sees the beginning of the soldering or welding of 1, a professed Christian religious system, with 2, the Roman state and its gods. Now, the second point I want to make is that we are missing this history, and by that I mean missing the understanding. And Wake Up America seminars, in their Lamb's Book, chapter 14, the 5th seal, show this point. They say, the 5th seal declares that circumstances are coming when the human race will be severely tested. The saints will choose something more precious than life. Those loyal to God and His Word will choose death rather than submit to Lucifer's demands. The saints will do this because their faith in God will trump their love for life. The saints will choose. Let me just correct that. The saints did choose, and certainly I hope they continue to choose. But also, Prophecy Watch, the forerunner Richard Rittenbough in his The Fifth Seal, makes a great point about ongoing persecution, but he falls flat when he pushes all of this to the future. Again, missing this history. He says, nevertheless, we tend to think of Christian persecution and martyrdom in the past tense, believing that modern ideas of religious freedom and tolerance make such murderous events impossible today. However, to reach such a conclusion would be a mistake. Not only are professing Christians currently undergoing discrimination and maltreatment, even in America, he says, but the Bible promises us that large-scale persecutions and martyrdoms of the saints will also take place before Christ's return. We find this plainly prophesied in the 5th seal of Revelation 6. So again, I believe it's the remnant, and that the fulfillment of it is history. So the interpretation by the historicist camp, if you will, of the great persecution fulfilling the 5th seal, the seal of martyrdom, It fits really well with all of the symbols and with his story or history, right? And agreeing with this, again, we see from Stack Exchange what is a historicist view of the seven seals. They say the symbols of historicism in the visions match major historical events in remarkable ways and in a chronology that actually occurs in the annals of history. Historical interpretation naturally takes much more work than pure symbolic or mere speculative interpretation, because one actually has to be familiar with the history of the world as it pertains to the Christian church. To be expected, the outcome of such hard work also leads to large amounts of information provided, as there is so much evidence to weigh. I would argue that you don't have to be a historian, but you can learn these things. The history, as I've said, is undeniable. It's at your fingertips, and you should be checking out everything that you hear here and everywhere else as well. They continue to say the fifth seal, the souls of those who had been slain, the era of the martyrs, centered on the Diocletian persecutions. Naturally, the symbols match, as the fifth seal is about the martyrs. Well, at the beginning of the video today, I touched base on this Psalms and the seriousness of touching the apple of God's eye. Let's read it, these verses. Precious in the sight of the Lord, Yahweh, is the death of his saints. O Lord, David says, truly I am your servant. I am your servant, the son of your maidservant. You have loosed my bonds. I will offer to you the sacrifice of thanksgiving, and I will call upon the name of Yahweh. Can you agree with this psalmist? Whether we're in persecution, day by day, trial by trial, whether we're facing life and death issues, the Lord is our Savior in all of those situations. And if he doesn't rescue us out of the present, we will join those who have entered their eternal rest. And their deaths are precious in the sight of Yahweh. This yet for a little season wasn't meant for them, the souls under the altar. They didn't need to know how long. Remember, they're not worrying at all. But we needed to know. Yahweh is letting the saints in the early church particularly know that he's about to unleash the trumpet judgments. Why? Because these seal judgments have almost completed their task, and that was to weaken this fourth beast of Daniel, the Roman Empire. The beast is going down. The Lord is saying, be patient. Payback is coming. And we are going to see the pièce de résistance of the seal judgments next time on the book of Revelation, Historicist View. Part 9, sixth seal, the tables turned. I hope that you can join me, but until then, stay well, keep studying, and shalom.